Another exercise with our watercolor paint. So there's two different things that I want to show you today. The first thing I'm going to show you is 3 different ways to make a color green, and just how very different the way that we put the colors together, the different effects that there is. And this is going to make a big difference, later on when we do our final painting. Okay, so our goal is to make the color green. So to make green again, we need blue and yellow, right? Okay, so what I'm going to start off with is I'm going to make 2 blue squares. I'm going to test it here. Okay, so I'm going to do it just on the bottom of my page because we're going to use this space here just to save on paper to do something else. So, okay, so I got 1 square. Doesn't have to be perfect, right? And I got my 2nd square. Okay, I'm going to wash my brush out really good. That first square, I'm going to let it dry. I'm going to do something with that 2nd square here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back. I'm going to make sure my brush is nice and clean. Right? That's why I have my paintbrush here, so I can, or my paper towel here, so I can always test it out. Okay, perfect. It's a good policy to sort of keep your water clean for watercolor paint so everything doesn't get all brown. So you don't need to, clean it too often, but if you're starting to find that it's getting really muddy, then just go dump it and change it, okay? All right, I'm going to get lots of yellow. While the second one, actually that's already drying, so this one's still wet. So while this is still wet, I'm just going to get some of that yellow in there. I'm going to do it halfway just so you can see. There's lots. This is still wet. The first square is still wet, and because I took a lot of that, I put a pure yellow into it, and because it's still wet, they automatically mix together on the paper. So this one, this effect is wet on wet. Okay, this one I'm just going to let it dry for 1 more second, and we're going to come back to it. Okay, so that has one type of green. Okay, so we're just using the blue and the yellow, and that has that one certain sort of look to it. Okay, I'm going to let this one dry. For this one here, I'm actually going to mix the yellow and the blue actually together on my palette to make a green, and let's see how different it is. So I always take a little bit of the darker color and I mix it in with the lighter color. Okay. I don't have great paper, so anyway, and that makes another kind of green, right? So definitely a different look. So you can see how this one's a little bit more see-through, right? And this one, it's a little bit more deep, okay? Now, let's try with this one. Now this one's dry, perfect. I'm going to clean off my brush really good. Nice and clean. I'm going to get some yellow. Let's put it over here. Oh, it's like a little bit of root with it. Okay, I'm going to test it out here. Oh, that's a nice one. A little bit more with water. Okay, so that looks like a nice yellow here. I'm just going to paint right over top of this, but you have to make sure this is dry. So you can see sort of a layering effect. So this is going to be wet on dry, and that this one's mixed in the palette. So for these 3, we use the exact same 2 colors, yellow and blue, right? Probably about the same amount, but it's just the way that we apply them gives you a much different effect, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind. So just using those 3 different techniques, because that's going to come in handy later on when we do our final painting. Now I want to go back to the different values and stuff that we did like in tattoos. Do you remember the sphere? So think back to the value scales and think back to our typography portrait where we had, where the light is hitting it, right? It's like a 0 value. There's nothing there. It's totally white. And then, value 1 where it's got slightly little bit darker, and then value 2 slightly more darker. Value 3 is even darker still. And then we go back to value 2, which is the same as this one. Okay, so that's what makes it look 3-dimensional. Of course, we have the cast shadow that goes all the way from as dark as you can go to very light. Now, using the techniques that we used for the layering, the wet on wet, we're going to try and mimic that technique onto your paper. So what I want you to do is on half of your page, what color is that? We're going to use red and green. Okay, So on your page, you actually have a green, so we don't even need to make it. Okay, so let's get a green. Now I'm showing off because I have a nice big brush. Okay, I'm going to test it out in here. Okay, that looks pretty good. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to like half my page. Doesn't have to be too fancy. I'm just going to, so you do have a wider brush, and hopefully in class I gave you one. And I just going to half my page, I just have green in the background. I'm going to let that dry. Okay, so I'm going to, while that's going, I'm going to let that dry, and I want to go back and I want to talk about our wonderful color wheel again. Remember our color theory? See how all this unit kind of brings everything together? So remember for graffiti, a little bit of our color theory. So this is our color wheel. So colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel are complementary colors. So this looks a little bit more purple than red, but it's blue and orange, purple and yellow, green and red. So again, black and white are not colors, but so the brightest contrast then in colors are going to be two complementary colors, or two opposite colors. So we're going to look at how to mix these two colors together and see what kind of effect that gets. Okay, so again, thinking of our spheres. We're going to do 4 different spheres. And so really lightly on this side, I want you to draw best circle you can, very lightly, okay? It doesn't have to be perfect, right? And a little bit of a shadow. Very lightly. Oh, my paper is all starting to do this. A little bit of a shadow. When this is dry, same thing. Okay? All right. Now, if you remember from our sphere, we have a light area, goes a little bit darker, right? It goes back again. So if you want to do that for reference, do it here. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Yours is going to be better than mine. Okay, so we're going to just talk about sort of blending our colors a little bit together because we know how to do the gradients. We know how layering sort of works, but we want to get that effect to make things look three-dimensional. So what is the opposite color of green? Oh, yes, red, right? Okay, so I'm going to use red. So I'm going to mix some of my red here. Okay, I'm going to test it out. Okay, that looks good. Now, I want to go from nothing to pretty light and then go lighter and lighter and lighter. I'm going to do this. I'm going to get lots of water because I'm going from light first, right? So it means I need it pretty transparent, which means I need a little bit of water. Okay, so again, always test. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm doing this whole sort of circle at once. So if you remember from our tattoo unit, when you made pencil lines, your pencil lines always follow the contour of your object, which even when you're painting, it makes your brush strokes should follow the contour of the object. Okay, so this one, I'm sort of doing it all at once. If you find that you need it lighter in there, I can dry my brush off a little bit, and I can actually go back. And if my brush is dry, if my brush is dry and clean, it actually picks some of it back up. Okay, don't push hard because you'll find that your paper is starting to break away. All right, I'm going to go back to that. I'm just going to do the same thing here because we're going to do one that's wet on wet, and we're going to do one that is wet on dry, like we did down here, right? So do your best. You have a bit of a smaller brush than I do. Don't forget your drop shadow, okay? Make that a little bit lighter. So there's no white paint in here, right? So how we get lighter is by having more water. All right, I'm going to let this dry and I'm going to come back to this, but this one's still wet. So I want a little bit more pigment, right? Because I want this a little bit darker. So I'm going to do my second one here. Okay, so that's too stark of a contrast, right? So it's no problem because I can come back and I want a bit darker. Now if it's wet on wet, oh, that's super dark. There we go. If it's wet on wet, it's easy for me to blend. Now, I don't know how well the video is showing with the lights. Go dark to light. Okay. So you have to work a little bit quickly when you're going wet on wet because you don't want it to dry, right? You want to keep it wet. So I think there's a lot of glare from the lights. Always judge it when it's dry. This one, okay, that's dry. So I want to try, you see the difference between the two. So this is, it'll have a very smooth sort of look. This one is going to take some patience because you're going to do each one at a time. And you're going to let that dry. And when that dries, we're going to come back and do another one. So we're going to let this dry. If you're at home and you have a blow dryer, you can totally just blow dry it. If we had some real watercolor paper, it wouldn't be too bad. I'm going to do the same thing on these sides, but I'm going to just do them both the same that we did here, but we're doing it on top of the green. You have to make sure that this is dry before you do this, though. Okay? All right, so again, I want nothing, because I'm going to come back to this one. I could do them both at the same time because I want to make sure that I have them dry. Your paintbrush marks are going to be round. You're always following the contour of the object. Right? Get that there. I need that lighter, so I'm going to take away some of it. Dry my brush off, and that way it picks up some of the paint. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a second. That glare is awful. I'm just looking at the, looks way better on here. Okay, do the same with my second one. This is smaller. Now we're looking at the color difference between, because we're painting two complementary colors. I have the red over top of the green. All right, so I'm going to let that dry. I think that's too stark. I'm going to take some of it off. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to go back in here. This is still wet. I'm going to get a bit darker. Same thing I did here. Please take more time doing yours than I'm doing for mine. I am just trying to go fast because I'm sure you don't need to sit here for hours and watch me paint. Okay, then I need to go back to stage 2 for that final one. Okay, I don't know if you can see this great, but that's starting to come along. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. Oh, this one's dry, so I'm going to go back to that. I'm going to do the next stage. So you're sort of working back and forth. With watercolor, you got to be a little patient. So there's a thin line here, and then it comes along. If you need to blend it, don't use too much water. Okay, I let that dry. I come back to this one. This one's dry yet. Actually, I can be shadow in there. Okay, when this one's dry, I'm going to do the same thing and go to the next stage for it. One thing you can, I don't know if you can start to notice it. If I'm working wet on dry, I don't know if you can tell, the stages, I'm trying to see if you can tell in there, the stages are more defined if I'm working wet on dry. If I'm working wet on wet, the water sort of bleed together and it's sort of harder to control. Okay, is that dry yet? Yeah, so I'm going to go back and just finish that off. Okay, so from my perspective, I'm not sure how it shows up in the video, the wet on the dry, the stages are way more defined. This one, it sort of ends up blurring all together and spreading. Okay, so let's try this one. And there's something else that I want to point out too. A bit of water. Okay, I'm going to let that dry. You're going to let it dry. I'm not, because I'm being bad. Okay. So a couple things. Wet on wet has a very more blurry sort of effect. So I'm not sure if this is any better if I go closer. You can see it maybe a little bit better. It sort of has a more blurry effect. The wet on top of the dry has definite more stages and is way more distinct. One thing that you notice if I'm painting over top of the green, I have two complementary colors. I sort of get this other color. I get sort of this gray tone. And the reason why I'm choosing that is because when we start doing portraits and faces, that you'll notice like in their palette, there's like, oh my gosh, what is skin color, right? Like we're not yellow, we're not brown. Like what is skin color? There's no white. How do I do it? Well, in fact, we are very much complementary colors. We have cool colors, which is our veins, right? The bluey sort of greeny color in our veins running one way. That's deoxygenated, and then we also have like the oxygenated red sort of blood. So we have a lot of green and red pigments sort of in our skin. So even if I hold this up, as a lighting, I do have a lot of those, right? So regardless of how dark or how light you are, all of that stuff is feeding through. So this is why we're going to be working with complementary colors, whether it's red and green, whether it's blue and orange, depending on, what color skin tone we want. We're going to be using those complementary colors because when we layer them, we definitely get this really neat effect. This one, I think it's hard to see in the camera, but when you try it, this one looks very pinky, right? And we're not pink, right? Our blood is red. Okay, so I want you to try that in your book, those two exercises here, and just take your time with that and be patient and let it dry in between stages.